Hi, I'm Jim. The United States is where I was born, where I grew up, and maybe where I'll die. The US exists because its founders found the Enlightenment principles of individual liberty and reason to be incompatible with those of tyranny. As a result of this breaking free, um, the United States had to create its own identity. Over the centuries, it has become a melting pot for immigrants and a home of the free, many coming here to enjoy its freedoms and its Enlightenment principles. It hasn't been all good, though. Um, the country began by the genocide of millions of Native American people and stealing their land and their resources, the racist enslavement of tens of millions of people and their murder, the continued discrimination even after they were liberated, and so on. Still, I find something hopeful about the American struggle to live up to its ideals. And in this way, I think that America encapsulates the Solzhenitsyn dyad represented in the famous quote, "The dividing line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being." Nowhere is this more explicit than in the great American novel. Coined by the American writer John William DeForest, it, quote, paints the American soul, unquote, and provides a, quote, picture of the ordinary emotions and manners of American existence, unquote. In short, it's a time capsule, not just of the simple things such as what we wore or how we talked or what we did, but the more important things too, such as what we cared about, what we were willing to die and to live for, represents the human struggle towards something greater. This is not an exhaustive list. This list includes my favorite books. There are many books that can be categorized as a great American novel that I have not read. So I might create an updated version of this list sometime in the future. But these are the books that I chose. And for fun, I ranked them according to how well I feel that they encapsulate the story that I've been talking about. The human condition, the struggle for something greater, or to be what one feels one has within oneself to be. It is the story of the US. It is the story of us. This is the tale of an overweight Dominican American otaku named Oscar. Oscar yearns to fall in love, but he and his family are victim of the fuku, a multi-generational curse that plagues, at the very least, his family and originates with the first Europeans who set foot on the so-called New World and all of the calamity that resulted on the native people as a result. This is a fantastically written work, and it's one of my favorites. But this particular work doesn't always show up as much as some of the other ones on this list on lists of great American novels. Why is that? Let's look at maybe some of the reasons. Traditionally, I think we have some deep-seated assumptions about what it means to be American, and thus who should write a great American novel and who a great American novel should be about. it's an old criticism of English literature, right? Too many dead white guys. And the category has changed. And so we are seeing more diversity on these sorts of lists. This particular list, I think, is also um, flawed in that it doesn't express the full diversity of the American um, experience, but I will talk a little bit more about that later. Um, there's no doubt that uh, The Brief Wondrous Life is an immigrant story. And personally, I don't have anything against that. I don't rank it 6 on this list. Because of that, I think the immigrant story is the American story. Now, Oscar Wilde is partly a historical text, documenting key events in the history of the Dominican Republic, particularly during the regime of the dictator known as Trujillo. This was a really bad time in the history of the Dominican Republic, where a brutal dictator um, abused citizens. People were beaten up, people were kidnapped, and people were sexually exploited and violated. It is hard to separate the history of the American um, experience from that of Latin America, um, thanks to such historical um, artifacts as the Monroe Doctrine, particularly the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which made it sort of the American responsibility to provide for the defense of countries in Latin America. And I think the Caribbean is even closer um, to America in many ways. And in fact, the US invaded um, the Dominican Republic um, about twice, I believe. So America plays a key role in Dominican history, and Dominican history plays a key role in American history as well, I think. Um, so those are not reasons why it's uh, why I think it's not an American story, because I think um, it is a great American novel. Um, but this is part of the reason why uh, I ranked it 6, despite it being my favorite story. There is another reason um, why I was at least partly um, hesitant about including this book in the list, and that is the use of magic realism. In the book, there are a few characters and things that are supernatural in nature, such as the faceless man, the talking mongoose, and the fuku, which is the multi-generational curse we talked about. And this believable blending of realistic narrative and the supernatural or magic is called magic realism. It originates in Latin America and therefore represents Latin American culture and so on. Um, because of all of these different things that anchor the story in America, but also in Latin America, um, uh, in my mind, at least. And if you disagree, that's totally fair. But I think that the great American novel should be slightly more anchored on the particulars of American history and American culture. Still, more importantly, Oscar Wilde adroitly captures the immigrant struggle to free themselves and their family from the fetters of the past, to start a hopeful generation and break the cycle. This long narrative is told by someone who prefers to be called Ishmael, an inquisitive member on a whaling vessel called the Pequod. Now, the Pequod is engaged in a revenge quest against um, a really interesting character a non-human character, a white sperm whale called Moby Dick, and it's an interesting whale in that it is human-like in its description. It has a scar. It it has certain like facial um, features, but it's anthropomorphized and in some sense reflects human nature. I think um, the human nature for commerce, for revenge, and and sort of our motivations. And what makes this clear is Captain Ahab, um, who is engaged in this revenge quest, and really dooms the rest of the crew to this quest. It's a beautiful, um, convoluted, um, long story, and it's a mishmash of philosophy and, of course, fiction and epistolary and marine biology and so on. Um, Not since Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern has something been so convoluted and weird and ineffable, but also great. It's almost postmodern before there is a postmodern. Uh, so I just call it pre-postmodern. When I first read the book, I felt like it needed a bit of editing. Like if you were to edit the book down, you definitely could, and you can get a much tighter story, but then we wouldn't have Moby Dick. And so, in this way, I think it kind of represents the American story, in that it's a mishmash of many different things, and full of contradiction and movement forward and back and progress. But in the end, it is what it is. If it were different, it just wouldn't be the American story. Moby Dick is also part of the American Renaissance, which is a movement that began roughly in the about the 1830s and lasted until about the end of the Civil War. And it romanticized nationalism, and it generally called on America to live up to its principles. And as such, we can see some elements in the narrative that do that. The ship is composed of a motley crew of different faiths, tongues, colors, and backgrounds. Along the journey, over time, the barriers erase. Um, the harpooners are all minority figures. So there's Queequeg, who is Polynesian, Testigo, who is Native American, and Dagu, who is African. And their positions as harpooners disrupts traditional race narratives about white supremacy. In fact, Ishmael's diatribe against whiteness in chapter 42, called The Whiteness of the Whale, examines the complexities of such traditional narratives. Elizabeth Schultz, a retired University of Kansas professor of English, writes in Visualizing Race, Images of Moby Dick, an article published in the Melville Center journal Leviathan, great name, writes, analyzing his terror of whiteness, Ishmael realizes that in addition to royalty, nobility, innocence, and benignity, the color also signifies death, aberration, desolation, alienation, and most horrific of all, utter nihilism, utter meaninglessness. I think this is pretty fitting given the voyage, because thus is revenge, a pursuit that in the end is pointless. To quote the rapper Childish Gambino, who has also written about race and paradoxes in the American narrative, this is America. This personal narrative is about Holden Caulfield, a young man attending boarding school in Pennsylvania who gets expelled for poor performance, gets into a fight about a girl, and then decides to avoid going home until Wednesday, which is a few days away, when his parents receive notice of his expulsion. Caulfield is young, lost, and is searching for meaning. What he finds instead is a superficial world. He's always looking in the wrong places. For example, there's one humorous scene in the novel where um, the young Holden seeks company, not intercourse, with an escort, and fails to pay her, and she then gets her pimp, who then assaults Holden. Many early American settlers saw before them empty, seemingly endless plains, mostly due to the genocide of native peoples. And it was to them a new world, requiring the formation of a new government and a new culture that sought to separate itself from what was. In the book Tribe on Homecoming and Belonging, the American journalist Sebastian Junger tells the story of early American settlers who were captured by Native Americans. Early American history, featured hostilities between Native peoples, while they could still fight anyway, and early European settlers. And sometimes Europeans would be captured and brought to live among Native peoples. And what's interesting, and what Younger describes, is that many of these people actually preferred living this tribal lifestyle. In fact, even when they were recaptured by Europeans and brought back to their settlements, some would actually escape anew and rejoin tribal life. The point is that meaning wasn't just where you were. Sometimes Americans had to make it or to find it. Faced with nihilism, Holden decides to abandon everything, to run away from all of the phonies. So tear-jerking moment when his sister Phoebe, his 10-year-old sister Phoebe, discovers his plan and meets him with a suitcase, ready to abandon everything to be with her brother, or so that her brother is not alone. And to Holden, Phoebe represents an innocence that he wants to protect, that he feels the world, um, you know, will eventually corrupt. And I think that this deceptively simple story um, captures a moment in time in the 1940s. During the 60s, a lot changed, and it had its antecedents in the 1940s and before. And while the desire to preserve some innocence that perhaps captures some innate human virtue or nature is pretty universal, I think there's something particular, again, about the American story that struggles to keep itself from falling. This is not my number one, but it's a damn near perfect book. Um, the theme of trying to recapture the past, in particular, I think is classic. And despite 100 years since its first publication, I think that it's still speaks to many of the issues we have today. It tells the story of Jay Gatsby, a fantastically wealthy man, and there's a lot of speculation about who he is or how he got his money. Um, and he deeply desires to rekindle a past flame with Daisy Buchanan. However, 5 years have passed by, and she is now married to Tom Buchanan, who is the old money to Gatsby's nouveau. I think Gatsby uh, represents the achieving the American dream. He originates actually, as we find out later in the book, as a poor South Dakotan with no name. Uh, he was born James Gatz, and he reinvents himself and achieves fantastic wealth with the help of some um, underground figures. And though he's not an immigrant per se, um, he does strive and create this new identity, I think, as is quintessential to that immigrant story. And his climbing out of poverty, I think, is also part of that. And we also see the flaws of society in the 1920s, many of which still persist, but to a lesser degree. Right, we have made progress, but chiefly among these particular issues in the 1920s, uh, exemplified in the book are racism and sexism. And while the novel exposes Daisy's plight as a woman, her fight to be treated and thought of as equal, um, and what else? It shows Tom's white supremacy, right? And how it has this pseudo scientific kind of feel to it. It doesn't seem to have quite as much of a an issue with its own stereotypical depiction of a character named Meyer Wolfsheim, who is represented very stereotypically as this sort of miser Jewish character. Um, Now, I did find some research that was interesting about this. So, according to the accounts of Frances Kroll, a Jewish woman and secretary to Fitzgerald, Fitzgerald was hurt by accusations of anti-Semitism and claimed Wolfsheim merely fulfilled a function in the story, and his depictions had nothing to do with race or religion. Personally, I don't see the need in the stereotype. Many 1920s Americans were anti Semitic, and few questioned white supremacy. And, F. Scott Fitzgerald seems to be, at least during the time that he wrote the book, to be one of those people. So we can say for its time, Gatsby was somewhat progressive because, again, of its exposing of sexism and racism. Despite its tragic ending, Nick Carraway, the narrator, states, quote, "Gatsby turned out all right in the end," unquote. Gatsby, despite the lies, despite his indecent means to gain his wealth and his deep insecurities, um, and being embarrassed by Tom Buchanan in front of everyone, and being shot and killed by Wilson, turned out all right in the end. I think this is because Nick saw something in Gatsby that was beautiful despite his flaws. That there was something genuine about Gatsby's desire to recapture the past, and even if his means were not always upright, his intentions for the most part were. And again, I just think this is part of that American story. I was hesitant about including this book in the list because of the use of the supernatural. I wanted to compare like with like, and it was just difficult for me separating um, or putting together speculative fiction and fiction in one sort of category. Even when I read, I tend to have sort of a list for speculative fiction, which includes science fiction and fantasy, and I have a section for literary fiction or non-genre fiction. But this book is a masterpiece. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1998, and Morrison herself won the Nobel Prize in 1993. So what's different about Beloved, um, and also kind of like The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, is that the story is authored by a minority, in this case, a woman. And history is told by the victors, right? And this paints history, and it biases what we come to know and understand and appreciate about history. And so Morris's inclusion in this list helps to make it more balanced and diverse. So I recognize that this list represents sort of some of that bias that I was talking about in the American canon, the American literary canon. And I can only partly blame my formal education for this, which also had that bias, and literature in general has that bias because of the biases against minorities and people of color. And I do see that as changing, and we're seeing more inclusion of different types of stories in these sorts of lists of great American novels. But I certainly have more reading to do on this particular genre of book. So it's truly hard to imagine the American story without the inclusion of African Americans. I think that African American culture is American culture, and in a literal sense, they help build this country. So I did want to highlight that, and that's part of why this book is here. Okay. Beloved takes place in the mid to late 19th century, and it deals with the psychological and even physical trauma felt in the wake of slavery. Seth, a mother and former slave, lives with a virtual tree on her back. This is the many scars that she bears from the many whippings she experienced. And she is trying to move on with her life, right? This is post slavery, and she tries to live with and fall in love with Paul D, who is another former slave from the same plantation, the so-called Sweet Home. And her current home is haunted by the spirit of her eldest daughter, who was murdered. And her spirit, much like the Fuku, is this sort of lingering haunting that is happening as a result of a terrible past, in this case, slavery, right? It kind of shows that just because slavery is over doesn't mean that the after effects of it are over, right? And speaking of that, the traumatic, heart-wrenching moment in the book involving Seth and her daughter is actually it's actually inspired by real life. First, I have to talk about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to get further context. It's possibly one of the most evil laws in American history. It essentially gave the legal authority for slave owners to kidnap their enslaved victims. Now, consider for a moment how terrible that must have been for the escaped victims. How traumatic it must have been to sort of see them coming and to know like they're already too close. You can't get away. You're in a house, and your children are in the house. And That's essentially what happened with Margaret Garner. And she barricaded herself and her family in the home. And with the U.S. Marshals approaching, she did the unthinkable. She she took the life of her daughter. Um, and if this is difficult for you to comprehend, to understand why a mother would do that to her own children, um, I think that um, perhaps there's either a lack of imagination or real knowledge of slavery. Um, I do um, think that there is a current bias today among many to think that slavery was mostly about free labor and that it was bad, people were whipped, but you know, it ended, it wasn't such a big deal. Certainly, people today um, say such things, right? In a political landscape, often in one way or another, say things that belittle slavery, like everyone was a slave and so on. But I do think that there was something very specific about American slavery. It wasn't just about free labor, right? It was about torture and dehumanization and embarrassment and so on. And if you don't believe that, here's just one detail, right? Because I could literally go on for hours. But uh, in order to break the spirit of and to dehumanize slaves, male slaves were sometimes made forced to copulate, to have intercourse with their own mothers, and that's where the mother effer term comes from. It's hard to fault a mother who loves her child so much um, that that she's able to do something like this. But I do think it might be difficult for contemporary readers to kind of understand that, and I think maybe that's part of the reason why um, Toni Morrison found this to be such a compelling story. So, Beloved, like The Catcher, um, demonstrates like this innocence that needs to be protected and a love that sort of overcomes. And I feel like America is like that. It has fought um, against its demons, um, and literally through the Civil War. And Morrison just sheds light on the special case of the African American plight, and I think it's had deeper scars than others, and we still struggle to keep ourselves or to free ourselves from that dark past. It's hard to argue The Grapes of Wrath is not a great book. It won the National Book Award in 1939 and the Pulitzer Prize the following year. Steinbeck also won the Nobel Prize in 1962. I'm a fan of Steinbeck. The book is set during the Great Depression, right, which began roughly with the stock market crash of 1929, and it lasted until about the start of World War II. It's one of the most severe economic downturns in American history. For some context, the U.S. GDP fell by about 15% during that time, and U.S. GDP fell by about 5.1% in total during the Great Recession. So this period, the Great Depression, is characterized by extreme poverty and unemployment. The Grapes of Wrath is about the Joats, and they are a poor Oklahoman family of tenant farmers who were hit particularly hard from the economic effects of, well, the economic and agricultural effects of the Dust Bowl. So this was a dire agricultural crisis centered on the Great Plains region, coinciding with the Great Depression in time. Severe dust storms, soil erosion, and droughts were common. The Joats leave everything behind to go to California, right, which holds in the book kind of a mythical, Edenic quality to it. And they do that desperately with other Okies, and they form this giant mass of people and families, all looking to create and to have a better life. During this mass migration, um, they experience exploitation and discrimination. And to fight these social injustices, the characters find resilience and dignity in solidarity. The book exposes exploitative capitalist practices, um, and many of the characters, particularly Jim Casey, a doubtful preacher, find solace in some socialist ideas. And this is part of the controversy, maybe in the book, right? It's an American story, but it's harshly criticizing um, the part of what many people like about America, right? Many people argue that part of the reason America is so great is because of capitalism. Okay, um, so yes, one of the great American novels on this list, and my number one, promotes some socialist ideas. And to me, part of what it means to be American is to criticize your country, not because it sucks or one isn't patriotic, um, but because there's a precedent for that in the founding fathers. I mean, Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, MLK Jr., etc. They all fought um, against injustice because they felt that the the country will overcome one day. The story is a masterpiece, like many of the works. I would argue, like all of the works on this list. Um, the scenes, the characters, the dialogue all come to life. It is not a story you easily forget, and you see yourself in the Okies and their struggle, and you realize we're all Okies in the end. We're all trying to find a better life and to fight off life's slings and arrows through love, through family, and through purpose. In conclusion, America, despite its greatness, was and is and will likely always be flawed. It has its origins in genocide, its past in enslavement, segregation, and discrimination. Currently, there is economic injustice and systemic bias. As human history has shown, it's a slow crawl to learn to walk and then to run. We will fall and cry and stub our toe. We will get up again. And sometimes, after falling again, we will be afraid to stand at all. But I think that one day this nation will grow up and stand tall and run past the past. That is my hope. And that's why I believe in the American story. And these books reflect that despite how messed up we are, we can overcome one day. That's it for me. This was a long one, and my face, for some reason, being in front of the camera makes it really itchy. So I'm sorry about that. Yeah, I tried to sort of give as much detail as I could. There is an accompanying blog post that comes with these sorts of videos, so that you can read along or enjoy that after the video or before to become familiar with some of the content. Either way, it's just something that I enjoy doing, and it has further links or details if you want to look at that. That will be available on my website, jamesnoguera.com. That's Noguera, last name anyway. And just thank you for your support. Thank you for listening. If you've made it all the way to the end to this super long video, then please just let me know in the comments. And I'm humble and I'm willing to learn. And if I've made mistakes, or if you have ideas on how I can improve, I will definitely check that out and we'll definitely consider. Anyway, if you like these sorts of videos, on the screen will be other videos that that are part of this channel that have similar sort of content. And I hope that you enjoy those. Till next time.